Welcome to this IANA webinar. Is your safety culture aligned with the new CSA scores? Understanding the new item response theory model. I'm Hal Pollard, the Director of Education at IANA, and it's great to have you join us. It's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed presenter, Steve Bryan, the Executive Vice President and General Manager of Samba Safety Transport. Steve is a longtime member of IANA, a great supporter of the community, and has extensive background working to improve safety, particularly on our roadways. Today, Steve will take us through the history of the CSA program, the current CSA methodology, then take us on a deep dive into the CSA IRT Scorecard model, which will take approximately 45 minutes. Then we'll wrap up with some questions. So, let's get started. Over to you, Steve.
Well, thank you very much, Hal. I appreciate that nice introduction. It's always surprising and somewhat alarming when people use the word esteemed next to my name, but I'll take it. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all enjoying a early, beautiful spring afternoon wherever you are. I'm calling in from Denver, Colorado, where we are seeing a beautiful, sunny, clouding slowly over, but beautiful day. So, again, thank you for your attendance. As Hal indicated, I'm going to take no more than about 45 minutes to run through a presentation here that will hopefully give you all an introduction to this new statistical model that is being proposed and will be rolled out later this year by FMCSA as the new foundation for the CSA program. So it is a new, much more complex statistical model that the agency is proposing will form a better, more trustworthy, more accurate CSA program going forward. So I'm going to try and help you understand it. My goal today is to have you go back to your companies and be able to speak about what this IRT program is, how it works at a very high level. It is very complex science. We are not going to try to make you PhD statisticians today. In fact, just the opposite. What we're going to try and do is give you some vocabulary and some concepts that you can take back to your companies and begin to educate your companies, your drivers, your bosses, your customers as to what all this stuff looks like going forward. So to start with, I like to start with a little bit of a timeline. I want to set a kind of a reset so that we all are on the same page as we move forward here for the next few minutes as to how we got here. What is it that brought us around really over the last decade since CSA was originally proposed and then launched? How is it that we have come to where we are today with this new model that is rolling out and all of the changes and the sophistication and the complexity that comes with these changes? So I think that's a good place to start. Before we jump into that, I always learned at speaker school that there are three things you want to make sure your audience is presented and comes away with and understands at the end of any presentation. So no more than three. Three is a good number. So here's the things I want you to maybe jot down on a piece of paper and understand when we wrap up here today. I want you to go away with the concept that, think of the title of this webinar. It is your safety culture ready for the new CSA? So number one, I want you to think about at a high level, the concept of the new CSA program is using data to directly measure the safety culture of every motor carrier in the United States. Now, that may sound like an odd thing to measure, culture. How do you measure someone's culture on anything, let alone safety culture? But that is exactly what this is proposed to do. So I'll try and help you understand why that makes sense. Second thing I want you to think about is nearly everything you know about the existing CSA program is going away. And I'm going to go through what those building blocks, the things that most of you have been living with CSA for the last decade, you're going to see that they are going to change dramatically and in many cases simply no longer be components of CSA. And the third and final takeaway from today is I believe, and Samba Safety has spent a lot of time on this now, it is my belief that this is a significant improvement to the old CSA system. So you'll hear me talking about things. I'm going to use some examples in here as to why I think it's better, but I want to be very clear up front. I am a believer in this. It is not perfect by any means. There's still issues that we need to, as an industry, keep working on and keep pressure on FMCSA and DOT to keep making this better over time, but this is leaps and bounds in improvement over the existing CSA system that I know a lot of us understand has been so problematic. All right, so safety culture, building blocks are changing, and this is a significant improvement. Those are the things I want you to keep in mind. Now, let's jump in and talk about the timeline. I'll spend a few minutes on this slide. I promise this is going to be this one may feel long, but I think it's important we all understand kind of the roadmap of how we got here. And then the next slides will go a little more quickly. So don't panic if you think I'm spending all this time on one slide. All right, first of all, we go back nearly over 10 years ago. It was fall of 2008 when the FMCSA started what they called pilot testing on this brand new statistical measurement system that they called CSA, Compliance, Safety, and Accountability. At the time, they were calling it CSA 2010 as a nod towards their plans to test it for a couple of years and then launch it in 2010. They were successful with that. They actually developed pilot testing programs in 8 states around the country, and then in December of 2010, just as the clock was running out, they actually turned it on. It became the new definitive method of measuring safety in motor carriers, and we all started to figure out how to live with the CSA program. A lot of education, a lot of products, a lot of all kinds of activity around it, from seminars to webinars to products to services to new telematics, all kinds of things aimed at improving CSA scores. So we as an industry got up to speed on it. We lived with it for 5 years. Going into 2015, there was finally, I would call it nearly a boiling point, where the industry, largely led by groups like IANA, like the American Trucking Associations and others, had finally gotten the attention of Congress that the defects, the biases, the failure to properly predict crashes, those types of things that we all got real frustrated with, disparate enforcement priorities around the country in different states, the lack of crash preventability, a laundry list of things that the industry had identified as shortcomings to the CSA program, finally reached the ears of Congress in 2015, kind of spring of 2015. There were a couple attempts to get language into various bills to deal with this, and finally that was successful in the very end of the year in the highway bill, what was known as the FAST Act, signed by President Obama in December of 2015. This bill was very large, over 1,000 pages, and largely dealt with infrastructure funding. However, embedded in that was a couple of pages of language that specifically directed the FMCSA to begin a process of reforming the CSA program. So President Obama signed that in early December, and there were 2 immediate impacts from his signature hitting the signature line on the FAST Act. The first of them was virtually that day, CSA scores were removed from public view. That was one of the requirements. So upon signature, the agency pulled CSA scores out of public view, and the whole CSA system, the website they ran, went virtually dark for the better part of a week. It came back and lacked any further public view of CSA scores. So, of course, the industry's position there was, with all of these problems, and now with the attention of Congress, let's take away this view to these scores that were being abused by companies or people like plaintiffs' attorneys. Sometimes insurance was using these for inappropriate reasons. Customers didn't understand scores, so very painful outcomes from seeing these scores. So that was outcome number 1 from the FAST Act, was scores were removed from public view. Outcome number 2 was a process began, a very clearly defined process involving a group called the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. We'll just call them the academies, NAS, the National Academies of Sciences. We'll just call them the academies from here on out. So what Congress said, I think in their wisdom, and many people don't hear the words Congress and wisdom in the same sentence very often, but in this case, they understood that the agency had not had a great track record of being forthcoming with changes and accepting of industry feedback. So rather than just saying, hey, FMCSA, go fix this thing, they very clearly outlined a plan where they were required to retain the services of this third-party think tank called the National Academies. Now, I don't know if any of you have had any experience with the academies. They are a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit. What they do for a living is do work largely for governments around the world to help them study and come back with recommendations to very difficult problems. So they look at everything from healthcare to education to infrastructure. They've even done some work with NASA on exploring other planets. So a lot of diversity in what the National Academies can bring expertise to. They do that by convening panels of outside experts who then are deployed towards the task assigned. In this case, a panel of 14 PhD statistician experts were organized and deployed to review everything they could look at around the CSA program and come back with recommendations as to how to reform it to be a better system. So that was their task. They began that immediately upon the signature of the FAST Act, and they had exactly 18 months to complete their task. That's written into the FAST Act. So just exactly 18 months later, they released their report. So we're now at June of 2017, and the academies released their report and had identified a statistical model that they believed would form a better foundation for measuring safety, specifically safety culture in a motor carrier and in the industry. And that's the first time many of us started to hear reference to what is called item response theory, or IRT for short. That was the recommendations of the academies. We think this model, a time and battle-tested statistical model. This is not new, snazzy science. IRT is a statistical methodology that has been in use going all the way back to the 60s. It is largely developed around education, testing. So in sending tests out to groups of students, think about things like SAT scores, GMAT, LSAT, advanced college entrance exams, things like that. Many of those kinds of scoring systems are built on an IRT model. So it is not new. It has been in use for a long time, and I'm going to get into a little bit of detail here in a few minutes to explain why the academies believed that an IRT model, successful in areas like education and testing, could also be used in looking at truck safety. Some of the other areas IRT is deployed is in what the statisticians call psychometrics. They are things like how happy are you, how sad are you, how depressed are you. So they take populations of people and using testing as the basis of this, questionnaires essentially, they are able to get responses to those questions. So item response theory could just as easily be called question and answer theory. So think of it in the context of testing, asking a lot of questions and looking at the answers. Items and responses being the questions and answers. And based on the patterns of those responses, IRT gives us the capability of measuring somewhat seemingly immeasurable things like how happy are you, how sad are you, and in this case, how safe are you. So that's where the academies believe this could be deployed. That was their proposal, was we believe this model could be deployed to directly measure the safety culture of the entire trucking industry and, in fact, individual trucking companies using this IRT model. So the agency took that report in the summer of 2017, studied it for about a year, and in the summer of 2018, August of 18, so this would have been last August, came out after a public listening session, and the new administrator and some of his staff announced at the time that they were going to take these recommendations. They'd studied it, they believed it was the right approach, and that they would begin, once again, pilot testing, but now on the new IRT model. That was last August, and at that time, they declared that they would have this built and ready for launch and release as the new CSA program in September of 2019. So that is this upcoming September. We have tried to stay as close as we can to the agency and their work on this. And as recently as February, we have been given strong indicators that they believe they are still on that track and that September is still the date. So that's kind of the timeline. Of course, looking forward, this is speculating now, but again, going back and referring to the language of the FAST Act, it is clearly laid out in the Act that if this reform is successful, then and only then can the agency go back to Congress and others and request that scores be made public again. So I would not worry too much about that. I would say that even if they hit their September release date, I would say probably at least another year of testing and feedback and work on this before we could even imagine the agency proposing that these scores be public again. So wouldn't panic over that, but that is the timeline as we see it historically, and bringing us up to speed, up to the date, and then perhaps looking a little bit down the road. All right, so we've seen the timeline. This next slide is one that I call the temperature of CSA. So if you also think about it kind of as a timeline, you go back historically, this is a chart produced each year by our friends at ATRI, the American Transportation Research Institute. Many of you probably know their work. They do excellent work every year in surveying and studying the data on trends and topics that are of high interest to the trucking industry. And each year in the fall, they produce their top 10 issues of the trucking industry. And if you look at the bottom, working your way up, 2010, you can see that was the year CSA released. It was the number 2 item. It was the second hottest item that year on ATRI's survey. And you can see throughout the next year, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15, it stayed right there in the top 3 or 4 in one example year. In 2011, it hit 4, then jumped back up again. Some of you might remember 2012 was a year of large reform. That was the year that we did away with the cargo securement basic and rolled it into vehicle maintenance, made a bunch of other major changes, caused a lot of attention to be put back, and that's the year it hit the number 1 spot. Now, if you look at 2016, of course, the FAST Act is just signed, and really CSA went into back burner simmer mode there for a while, and it's now stayed in the number 6 position for 3 years running. The reason I like to show this is I think if we can imagine, given all these changes, and given what we saw in 2012 with this kind of large change to the program, I suspect when ATRI runs this report next year or this year in the fall, we will probably see CSA move way back up the chart again certainly into the top 3 positions. So be prepared for this. While CSA has not been a huge topic in the last couple of years, it is coming back, in my opinion. So that's my temperature forecast for the program. All right, next slide. This is language. I won't read this out loud, but this is language lifted directly from the FAST Act. These are specific items that Congress required the academies to address. So this was not a open-ended, hey, just go see if you can make this better. This was a very specific laundry list of items that must be addressed in any reform effort. They include things like disparate enforcement between the states. How's it going to handle that? How's it going to handle the math that allows carriers who move from one safety event group to another to have spiking and plummeting scores month to month? How are we going to handle the fact that many small motor carriers simply don't have enough data to be scored at all? So there was a very specific list of requirements, and as we go through this, I'm going to circle back and hit some of those high spots and show where, in my opinion, the agency has done a pretty good job of hitting these specific requirements of the FAST Act. So we're going to jump now out of that backgrounder and kind of into the specifics of what this new methodology looks like. Real quick, before we do that, and just as a quick review amongst all of us, let's review the current system. So I know we're all experts in this. We've all been dealing with it with CSA for a long time now. But just as a review, in case we've got anybody on the line that could use a quick review, let's talk about how the system today works. Then we're going to shift to the IRT model and deconstruct this pyramid that you see, and we're going to rebuild in its place the components that make up the IRT model. And hopefully that'll be the really meat and potatoes of today's webinar. So let's take a look at that. All right, start at the bottom of the pyramid and let's work our way up. The whole system, the whole CSA program is based on data collected at roadside inspections. That's where it comes from. It's the only place it comes from. In round numbers, law enforcement today in the 50 states conducts about 3.5 million inspections, and from those inspections flow about twice that number of violations that come from those inspections each year. Now, those violations can be one of a menu of 945 different possible CSA violations. So we're familiar with these. These are all written right into the FMCSRs, the safety regulations. They are well defined. They are well known. It's not all of them in the FMCSRs. It is a subset, again, 945 of them that make up the fuel of today's CSA system. The way that works is expert opinion, and I'm going to circle back to that term here in a minute because the National Academy's focused on this very sharply. Expert opinion was applied to those 945 violations to give a severity weight of 1 to 10. These are people who were looking at these saying, well, that one's a 7, and that one's a 4, and that one's a 10. Also, out of service, there's an extra points you get for if one of those is an out of service, and then there's the time weighting, the 3, 2, 1 descending value based on whether it's current, 6 months old, 12 months old, 18, and then it's out of the system. So that's the way that the points get assigned today, is using these severity weights that are the construct of expert opinion. Now, today, looking back about 2 years, and CSA is, remember, built on a 2-year look back, there's about 43.5 million CSA points in the system today. Those are obviously distributed out to the appropriate DOT numbers, the motor carriers that accrue those points, and then those are computed into what's called a CSA basic measure. It's a fairly simple calculation. It is essentially CSA points divided by either the number of relevant inspections, or in the case of the crash and unsafe driving basics, it is points over power units. So a simple calculation, you get a numerator, denominator, you get a number, and that number then determines where you are and what safety event group you are placed into. Now, safety event groups, there are 5 of them. Just think of them as the number 1 is the small guys, the number 5 are the mega carriers, and everybody in between, based on their inspection or power unit counts. The problem that we had, a big problem with safety event groups, is there a bright line definition between one group to the next. So we had the problem of a carrier having one more inspection or buying one more truck, and it puts them over the line into the next safety event group. And it was a matter of fact always if you moved up. If you went from safety event group 3 to 4, your scores spiked. If you came down, if you sold a truck and moved down, your scores plummeted. So it was simply a construct of the safety event groups, and that was a huge problem in this, and people would get their updates monthly. They were fine this month. The next month, they're up 30, 40 points in CSA just by virtue of having, say, another inspection, even if it's a clean inspection. So a real problem with the way those safety event groups work. Finally, those safety event groups, once you're in them and you have your points, we are able to compute your basic percentile, a 0 to 100 score, and then based on thresholds set by the agency, if you cross those thresholds, you get the dreaded yellow triangle, the CSA Basic Alert. So that's the flow of today's CSA system, and I'm sure we're all very familiar with that. So let's now jump from that and talk a little bit about what comes next. How do we rebuild this thing and begin to talk about what item response theory is and how that new model might look? All right. So before we jump into that, I just want to talk again a little bit. I hit on this briefly, and I want you to go away today with some vocabulary, some concepts that you can take back to your companies and talk about. So let's revisit the IRT vocabulary. Think about testing. Think about education. You're sending out millions of tests with many more millions of questions, and then you're evaluating the answers, the responses to those questions. The IRT science is way smarter than just right or wrong. So this is not sending out a 100-question test and you miss 10, so therefore you get a 90. What it looks at is which 10 did you miss. It's very good at identifying that the fact that you missed these 10 questions as opposed to a different 10 is really what informs the culture score, which is really what IRT is producing. An example I use is if I'm in a college semester with another student, and the other student and I take the same courses, we take the same final exams, and at the end of it, that other hypothetical student, let's just use to make it sound like CSA, let's say we took 7 courses, 7 basics. In one of those courses, that other student kind of did mediocre, pretty well in 6, not so well in one of the 7. I, on the other hand, kind of was mediocre across the board. I was out partying, I was having the fun college life, I was going to the football games. I didn't do very well in anything. IRT will punish me very badly for that. It will see me as having a culture of not being attentive to my studies. That's basically the best way I can state it. So it does that not by looking at the number right or the number wrong, but the patterns of my incorrect responses and exactly what those patterns look like. And we're going to get into patterns more in just a minute here in terms of CSA. That's the piece to remember from this. It's smarter than just right or wrong and giving you a percentile score. It looks at what you got right or wrong compared to the rest of the industry, and it identifies where you are outside of the expected pattern of your responses. So let's move on now and let's talk about our pyramid again. Remember, here's our existing, what I'm calling the CSA Classic pyramid. This is what we just went through. So the question then arises, okay, well, what's different? What changes? Remember, number 2 on my takeaways for today is much of what you know about CSA is no longer relevant or valid. So let's start at the bottom and let's work our way up this pyramid and see what changes. First of all, I think some good news. The roadside inspections stay exactly the same. The number of possible CSA violations stay exactly the same. What I think the academies understood was to change the federal safety regulations to redefine specific violations or to change them would be a huge undertaking. I myself think that if somebody said, Steve, do you want to change the FMCSRs or do you want to change the United States Constitution? I'd take on the Constitution. It'd probably be easier. So a lot of difficulty there. So the academies said, let's leave this alone. Let's work with the same law enforcement personnel enforcing exactly the same violations, conducting the same inspections around the country. Now, that's not to say that there isn't room for improvement there. There absolutely is. But the academies saw the wisdom, I think, in focusing first on a better methodology, and then we can focus on better data collection practices and things like that. So those stay the same. Here's where things start to change. In the Academy's report, they looked at the expert opinion that had been applied to the severity weights, and they called it ad hoc. That was the language they used. See, if you're a ivory tower PhD type, and you want to say something critical of somebody, you always say it in Latin, because if you do that, it doesn't sound nearly as critical. So you say ad hoc instead of the way we truckers would talk about it, which might be a little more blunt. So the point was, the academies said, IRT, the item response theory, doesn't require human input. It decides which of those violations is more critical, not just based on right or wrong, but on the patterns of those violations as they appear in the data that comes back from the field. So this is a good place to point out, we are not going to be sending questionnaires or tests out to the trucking industry. While that is the way IRT works historically, the academies said, look, we have essentially a proxy for that. We are conducting inspections. Think of that as the test. and we are receiving violations. Think of those as the answers, the items and the responses. And their theory in this was perhaps we can use these inspections and violations as a proxy for the tests and for the items and the responses that IRT is used to. So let's try that. That was their proposal with IRT. But the first thing that's removed is the application of those human expert opinion severity weights. They are gone. They no longer exist. Now, you can probably begin to see what happens rather quickly. If we don't have severity weights, no out-of-service points, and no time weights, how do you suppose we end up with CSA points in our system? And the answer is we do not. There is no longer a concept of a CSA point. Now, I know that may sound alarming because that's how we have all been taught to think about CSA and points and which violations do we focus on and how do we manage this, but they no longer exist in IRT. Without CSA points, how do we compute a CSA basic measure? Remember our numerator and our denominator. Points over inspections, points over power units. Well, we don't have points. Therefore, there can be no CSA basic measure. And without a basic measure, we no longer have the ability to define what safety event group they're in. There are no more safety event groups. They go away. Now, we've carved out a pretty good chunk of the middle of our model here, so you have to start to wonder, well, how are we going to now compute basic percentiles under IRT? And the short answer is we are not. We no longer have basic percentile scores. So now you're probably scratching your head and saying, well, there's nothing left here, Steve. What in the world are we going to hang our hat on? And at this point, you probably are a little bit nervous that I'm going to tell you that the 7 basics are going away because that is the backbone of CSA. It's what we've all learned to understand and think about CSA in these 7 basic categories. The academies understood that investment in training and time and suggested we keep the basics as they are. So now we're going to rebuild our IRT model, knowing that what we're building towards is a new way of scoring those 7 basics. And that's what we're going to now rebuild. So as I said, roadside inspections, same exact officers. We literally don't even have to tell law enforcement that anything's changed in the CSA system. They're going to continue to conduct the inspections, find the violations. They're going to continue to find the same violations, so the same 945 violations. So same inspections, same exact violations reported by law enforcement. No changes there. Now, here's where things start to get very, very different. IRT has a problem that it runs into with 945 different violations. So now what we're going to do, I want to explain here as to why we're going to shift gears a little bit here and look not at individual violations, but at violation groups. And this might make sense to you. Think of the 945 violations as those questions that we're asking, those items to which we need responses. Well, out they go. The problem is, if you think of it in a testing environment, it's as if we sent out a test with 945 questions on it. The problem is, in trucking, no motor carrier has all of these. They don't even have half of them. Nobody does. So what you end up with is almost all incomplete questionnaires. They're coming back almost virtually all incomplete. And IRT didn't like that, didn't like to run. That didn't make sense to it. So what we do is we now move to a level where we are not looking at the individual violations in IRT, but groupings of them. So this is a construct that already exists. It is defined in today's CSA methodology, and that is the concept of the violation group. There are exactly 66 of them in today's methodology. So we all know what they are. It's somewhat intuitive to us. Things like brakes, lights, tires, certain hours of service groupings, things like that, drug and alcohol, vehicle maintenance. So we're all familiar with them. It's a way today where it's a convenience so that we can look, for example, at all brake violations in one cluster. We can look at all lighting violations in one cluster. IRT looks at these and says, aha, now what do I have? Now I have a questionnaire not with 945 questions, but with 66. And guess what? Lots of responses. Suddenly the industry is very rich and robust in its responses to these items. We have them because they're now groupings of them. This is the first thing. It's very key to understand these groups. If you have even one violation in the group, it is basically switched on. Think of this as a light switch. I'm going to talk a little bit about what these color codes mean here. We'll look at the upper corner here of vehicle maintenance. Let's just say, for example, that this first orange dot on the top left is brakes. Let's call that the brake violation group. You have any brake violation, even one, over a 2-year period, that lights up. You now have that present. Your response to that is, I have it. And IRT now weights that. This is where the IRT science now replaces that expert opinion based not on just a preconceived notion of the importance of that group, but of the expected patterns of responses. I like to think of this as one fictitious example of a motor carrier. This is their fingerprint, essentially. This scattering of patterns is how this motor carrier looks, given their history, and it is that pattern that is then compared to the hundreds of thousands of other patterns, and IRT decides your safety culture based on those comparative patterns. So this is the key. Now, the orange, red, and blue are simply a way of us illustrating the fact that IRT applies essentially weights to these that are not 1 through 10, but kind of 1 through 3, low, medium, and high. So low is blue, medium orange, red is high in our world. If it's an open dot, nothing in it, that means this motor carrier has no violation activity in that group. So this is now the key to understanding the new IRT world. This is how you will manage CSA going forward, is looking at violation groups, not at individual violations, because they don't matter anymore. It is the groupings that matter. All right, coming back to our model, we have IRT has evaluated those groups. It has applied a methodology. It has studied those patterns, as I've discussed, and comes back, keep building up towards our scores. Well, there's one component missing. There's one more thing we have to do. Remember our safety event groups. What was the purpose of a safety event group? It was to give us the ability to compare large carriers to large, small to small, medium to medium. And that's still important. IRT still needs some way of comparing carriers based on some sort of normalization. And we do that now. IRT does that through what's called exposure risk. All right, here's the way this works. IRT collects data, 5 data elements, and it uses those 5 data elements now to assign carriers an exposure risk index, a number that places them into somewhere in the universe of all carriers, so it understands in this location what is my expected pattern of violations. So again, it's all about patterns, it's all about exposure risk. So if you are many trucks, you're thousands or tens of thousands of trucks, and you operate all across the country, you're operating cross-border, you're operating in and out of ports, your exposure risk is very high, and that is measured by your driver count, your number of both vehicle and driver inspections, your power unit count, and your vehicle miles traveled. So those now form the inputs into this exposure risk index, and that replaces the safety event group in normalizing carriers against carriers. Now we've got our pyramid rebuilt. We now can compute our new CSA basic scores. The point I want to make about the new scores, they are no longer percentile scores. We're now dealing with very standard statistics, normal distributions, bell curves. These are things some of us have heard of. Not a 0 to 100. 0 to 100 percentile was an artificial construct. In the normal world of statistics, you look at normal distributions and standard deviations from the mean. What that gives us is a new range of scores. So you'll start to see scores in IRT that are not 0 to 100, but are in fact more like kind of 0 to like 200, with 100 being the new normal. So 100, if you picture in your mind a bell curve, that right dead center, the top of the bell curve, will be 100. It will be that for every single motor carrier. It will be that for every single CSA Basic. So everybody's now going to be looking at IRT scores in the future. Now, there's going to be some education here. There's going to be some gasps and some moments of discomfort as we explain to our bosses and to our drivers and to our customers that this 100 that I have in the new CSA system is not bad. It's actually expected. It's exactly where I am supposed to be. It's average. And below that, excellent. Above that is where we start to have questions about whether the safety culture here at this motor carrier is what we want it to be, and begin our remediation from there. And then finally, we have a new piece of the pyramid that goes beyond the 7 basics. We have a new single score, the safety culture score. Again, same numbering system. You are expected as a motor carrier, when you see your new IRT scores, the expectation is you will have one safety culture score, and the expectation is that score will be 100. That's what everyone is expected to be. So to the extent that your pattern of violations measured in groups varies from that expected score, that's what forms either above or below or right at your 100. Okay? So let's move forward. In the interest of time, let's do a few quick examples. These are just screenshots out of the product that we've built around this. I won't spend a lot of time on this. This homepage is showing you what your score is. This fictitious carrier here is an 86. That's their single culture score. That's very good. They're down but well below the 100. That would be a score to be very proud of. Excellent job. Now you want to go down, you can see side by side, we're comparing today's SMS scores with the new IRT scores. The point to take away is, while they are interesting to look at side by side, they bear almost no resemblance. It's apples and oranges. They just aren't the same. A percentile score versus a score out of a standard deviation are incomparable, but interesting to look at side by side. Our next screen shows that exposure risk, so you can see in the scatter plot where you as a motor carrier lie along that exposure risk continuum, where you are. Now, it's not where you are left to right on this that matters. You can be a very highly exposed carrier, be way off to the right. You're the biggest carrier out there. You've got tens of thousands of trucks and 1 billion vehicle miles, etc., lots of inspections, very high exposure. That doesn't punish you. What matters is your distance from the expected score of 100. So that's the key to this, is exposure shows you where you are, but there are no longer distinct, discrete groupings like safety event groups. So no more spiking of scores. That goes away. That's key. You go back to the FAST Act, some of those requirements. That's one of them. You must address the problems of the safety event groups, and this does it. It fixes that. It just essentially takes them away and replaces it with something where you cannot spike. Everything is done on a rather smooth continuum. You go acquire a new DOT, add 1,000 trucks, your exposure risk goes up, but you don't spike by virtue of that. So that's a key point to remember out of this. Next screen, and there's just one more after this. Now you're the safety director. Now you're managing safety at your carrier. You have to begin to understand, where do I need to focus myself? Just as before, you can't focus on everything. You can't boil the ocean. So you've got to understand where to go in this system. In today's world, you can pull it up. You can kind of look at the severity weights and go, well, look, I've got an inordinate number of those high severity weight violations. That's where I will focus my attention, and you would be correct to do that. You can't do that in IRT because those weights don't exist and no specific violations matter as much as the groups. So this is our way of giving you visibility into those groups to identify not just the violations, but when you can get rid of them. When can you turn those dots off? How do I make them go away in an effort to reduce my scores? And there are very large impacts from eliminating anything in a violation group. Again, it's expected patterns. So if you get out of those expected patterns, that's where IRT punishes you. Get back within the expected patterns, and you're going to do very well. This is the first view we give to help you with that. And then finally, And I know that's hard to read, but as with any system, today's system, you have to understand which specific violations are flowing into the system. And then finally, the key to all this, of course, is the human beings, your truck drivers. You've got to be able to get it down to which drivers are bringing my pain home. The problem now is it's very opaque. You can't just see the violation weights. You have to look through the lens of IRT to understand how it is weighting you with these violation groups, and now focus on the drivers that are bringing that into the system as opposed to just those that are bringing in the high severity weights. So that's the key to this. I went about 5 minutes longer than I said I would, but I will turn it back to you, Hal, for any Q&A that we have.
That's fantastic, Steve. Thanks so much. A great overview of a fairly significant change in everybody's lives, I think. We've got a bunch of great questions from the group here, and I'll start out with one that I think is on a lot of people's minds is IRT a foregone conclusion? Isn't there an analysis required to determine if it works better than the current model? Isn't there an IG report to Congress required?
Absolutely, yes, there is. That's absolutely spelled out in the FAST Act. That is the track that FMCSA has said they are on. And when they roll this out, we would expect them to begin to make that case to Congress. Now, remember, there's two bars here. There's kind of a low bar, and then there's a much higher bar. The low bar would be, is this an improvement to the existing system? And if the answer to that is clearly yes, then I think this will become the new CSA model. That's not a terribly high bar. Look, we all know the problems with CSA today, so making it better is not that high a reach. The higher bar is it high enough to bring scores back into public view? That's where the IG and Congress and many of the others are going to take a lot of time to study this, and that's why I said in the beginning, I wouldn't worry too much about that. But my opinion is, I think this is a significant improvement in some of those real painful areas like safety event groups and the disparate enforcement around the country. It has a very calming, smoothing effect on those disparate enforcement states like Texas and Indiana and smooths those out. So I think those, in my opinion, will rise to the level where FMCSA will move forward with this as the new CSA model.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Here's another good one. What exactly do you mean by public? Insurance agents seem to know the scores. Is it specific information that isn't currently being made public?
Good question. So previously, again, anybody with a web browser could type in a DOT number and see that motor carrier's CSA scores. Now, crash, hazmat were always kept private, but the other five, absolutely right there, you could see them. Those went away, as I said, following the FAST Act. Now, there are some services out there, third-party services, that have continued to make CSA scores available largely to the insurance industry. I won't name names. Many of you know who it is. But there are companies that made the decision to continue to feed that data to the insurance industry. I never thought that was certainly in keeping with the spirit of the FAST Act, but since the FAST Act didn't govern private businesses, some did continue to make those scores available. So that is true.
Got it. All right, here's a good one. How do they bring previous violations into this system, or is it a clean slate? How will it affect Intermodal, do you think? So it's a two-parter.
Okay, well, I'll take the first one first. So the system is still based on a 2-year look back. So let's say that they are successful in revealing scores for the first time in September. And I want to talk a little bit about that because it's not just an on switch. This is not just going to suddenly switch on someday in September. The best information we have from the agency is there is a new sheriff in charge at the agency, Ray Martinez. He is being much more cautious, much more thoughtful. He's much more concerned about education of the industry and adoption of this. So they're talking about, while they may turn it on as a preview in September, it will not replace completely the existing CSA until probably early 2020. That's the information we have. So don't think of it as just a light switch that's just going to, immediately switch on. I think we'll have a little bit of time to see how this looks side by side. What was your second part of the question? How does it affect Intermodal?
Yeah, do you see it affecting Intermodal in any unique ways?
there's always been unique problems to intermodal, with the chassis problems and, even just in and out of the ports. You're in congested areas that others aren't, et cetera. I haven't specifically looked at the data for intermodal. I think that would actually be a very interesting follow-up to this. But to the extent that we're seeing a lot of the same types of issues that we see from disparate enforcement. So you see hours of service is very high in intermodal. You see things like maintenance because of the chassis issues. You see more unsafe driving issues because of the high congestion areas that sometimes you operate into. To the extent that IRT smooths out those disparities, it should have a smoothing effect on intermodal. It should. I haven't specifically looked at that, but I have looked at a lot of the disparate enforcement issues of other segments and around the country, and consistently it does a better job. So I can't definitively say, but I suspect intermodal is going to find that they benefit from this as other segments are.
Okay, great. Here's one. Does the IRT process take into consideration anywhere for violations that are under dispute in data queues?
Yeah, data queues. Yeah, very important. Great question. So data queues will still be in effect. There is still going to be, and in fact, it's even more important. So if the key to this is removing violations from these groups, how important is it that we have a good, robust, solid data queues system? Very. Now, would anybody describe today's data queue system as good and solid and robust? I don't think so. So again, this is coming from various FMCSA representatives that I have heard make very public statements that they are working hard on improving the data queues system. I hope they're right. And I include in that the crash preventability problem. In fact, I just saw this morning, ATRI put out a notice that FMCSA now has said officially they will remove non-preventable crashes from the CSA score. So they seem to be moving forward with some of those kinds of the modifications. The removal of crashes and the removal of challenged violations will certainly continue and be important.
Great. Here's one. Will clean inspections better your scores?
Not necessarily in this. To the extent that your clean inspections mean you're not essentially illuminating a new violation group that you don't already have, that works. That's good. That's a good thing. But remember, it's not counting inspections. It's not stacking up violations anymore. So just the presence of a clean inspection doesn't hurt or help your score unless it means you're avoiding getting a new violation group.
Got it. We'll finish off on this one. How will challenges to the data be changed?
Yeah, I think again, data queues is the challenge mechanism. Yeah. So I suspect that will continue, and again, hope it improves.
Got it. Okay.
Let me make one comment, Hal, that wasn't asked that I think is important for people to understand, and I'll hand it back to you. The question I'll ask of myself is, Steve, what happens to driver scores? In today's CSA, each individual driver also carries a driver CSA score. Now, that's not widely utilized by a lot of people, but it is to law enforcement. There is a visibility of law enforcement into the specific scores of a driver. All gone in IRT. There is no more evaluation of an individual truck driver in IRT. This is all about the motor carrier. Why again? You're measuring safety culture. You're measuring the culture of an organization, not the safety performance of an individual driver. So, all right, Hal, take it away. Wrap it up for us. Thank you.
That is certainly a critical point, Steve. Thanks for making that. Well, that's all the time we have for today, I'm afraid. I'd like to thank Steve for joining us and sharing his insights on the evolution of the CSA, on what to expect from the new CSA IRT Scorecard model, and the emphasis on building a culture of safety in our organizations. Absolutely critical. For more information about topics like this, IANA membership, and how to get engaged, please visit intermodal.org. Thanks for joining us at IANA, the connecting force behind intermodal freight.